Okay, so I think we will get started, and welcome to those who I haven't personally said welcome to yet. So it's great to see you all here this afternoon. My name is Floss, and I'm part of Embodied Philosophy. So I thought we'd start before I hand over to Jacob with a little recap or reflection on last week's lecture, which I'm sure, or last lecture, which I'm sure you'll agree was really interesting and thought-provoking. So we were looking at rasa theory, which is this theory of emotion, of longing, of desire from the Tantric tradition. And Jacob talked about how in, say, the more classical yoga tradition of Patanjali, emotion's not really talked about, is it? It's very much stopping the mind or stopping the fluctuations of the mind. And for many of us, there can be perhaps a disconnect because we are emotional beings. We experience strong emotions as part of our human nature. So what's so interesting about engaging with this theory from the Tantric tradition is it has a place for longing, for desire, for our very much humanness in that tradition. And Jacob talked about this idea of reordering our desire and our longing and our emotion towards the divine. And interestingly, he talked about how this is an idea that we find in other traditions as well. So we find it in the Christian mystical tradition, for example, this idea of longing for the divine. We also find it in Sufism, the mystical arm of Islam. Okay. And so feel free to put on the chat how you found that these ideas of emotion and longing and desire from this tradition landing with you. And it's also interesting from a householder's perspective, right, as well, because we're not renunciates, which the classical yoga tradition talks a little bit more about. And so Jacob mentioned last day rather, on Tuesday, as some of you may remember, that Embodied Philosophy is opening the next year of sadhana school, which is the most exciting opportunity to engage with the yogic traditions and specifically the tantric traditions on an academic level, engaging with texts, but also in terms of a sadhana and in terms of a sangha or kula, right? As a community of seekers together. And this is the kind of thing we'll be engaging with in the sadhana school. So really bringing our own experience into play, reflecting on these traditions, these ideas, these texts in community to bring yoga philosophy alive into our lives, not just as ideas or texts, but as traditions that we engage with. Okay. And so if anyone is interested in sadhana school, but still on the fence, we are running some discovery calls, and I'll pop the link in the chat in a moment. And these are a great opportunity to learn more about the program, chat to us, and any questions you have. Okay. So I think that's all for now. Oh, there's a few things in the chat, so let me have a look. Madalena says, I experienced myself with no readings or traditions that a strong desire would turn into desire for the divine on its own, only to then recognize I was not full, but as you said, Christian mystics and Sufis resonate. Yeah, and this is the amazing thing about engaging with texts and also with each other as well, is that we find that it's not just an individual experience, but something that is shared. And the missing link to understanding my emotional self, I think for me as well. Okay, so thank you, everyone. I'm going to pass on to Jacob now. And today, yeah, really exciting. We're talking about the subtle body, which is also from the Tantric period, Tantric tradition, and I think can also very much enlighten us and our modern engagements with yoga. So thank you. Over to Jacob.
Thank you so much, Floss. That was such a lovely introduction. Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. Well, welcome back. Thank you for tuning in on lecture number 2 of the Living Room Lecture Series. It's going to be very interesting to sort of see the diverse numbers in each one of these talks, since it's kind of a reflection on where people's interests lie. And it's kind of an interesting thing to see just how much people resonated with this a topic of desire. And today, I mean, all of these talks are designed to sort of build on each other in a certain kind of way. But today we're going to look at we were looking at the power of desire, right? There's three powers actually that are spoken about, or three predominant Shaktis in the non-dual Shakta-Shaiva Tantric tradition: the Icha-śakti, the jñāna-śakti, and the Kriya-śakti. The Icha-śakti, the Shakti of desire, the power of desire. And we were speaking about that on Tuesday as sort of the unlimited will of the absolute. So the Swatantriya Shakti is the freedom of reality to take any form that it desires, to essentially manifest in any way that he, she, they wants. And then we have, and that is the kind of first movement, the first stirring of reality. And of course, when we say first, we're not talking about a linear kind of beginning of creation. We're talking about something sort of outside time, this sort of timeless cosmological picture or story, if you will. And then from desire emerges knowledge, right? So we're kind of moving through these in the way that the Tantra tradition speaks about them. So from Icha, from this power, this potency, this Shakti of will, of desire, of Icha, we have jñāna-śakti, the Shakti of knowledge. And the subtle body, right? Well, how does the subtle body have something to do with knowledge? And this is going to be very much what we're talking about today. Because when we're talking about the body, and even in the title of this talk, the coming from the subtle body or living from the subtle body in a disembodied world, the first question we should ask is, what do we mean by the body? Right? What do we mean by the body? What in according to what intellectual understanding or according to what knowledge system do we make sense of a distinction between what it is to be embodied and what it is to be disembodied? These very categories, this and that, either or, body, non-body, body, mind. These are dualistic categories that are embedded in what Wittgenstein called our language games, right? They are embedded in the language systems that we use to make sense of our reality, to make sense of our experience. And so when we don't call those into question, right? When we don't challenge or at least put into a spirit of inquiry or critical thinking, if we don't submit to our own critical thinking, what our presuppositions are, what our presumptions are, what our kind of bedrock assumptions of how reality functions are, if we don't, then they sort of go into the background. It's sort of this underlying certainty and set of assumptions that may support us and lead towards great results, or it may lead us toward a lot of limiting beliefs about ourselves or about each other or about what's possible in this lifetime. So, to go back to that very wonderful question from Tuesday, how we think about what constitutes the body actually does matter. And so even in the title, there's a little bit of a misnomer, because according to the Tantric tradition, there is nothing that is outside the body. There is nothing that is disembodied. Everything is the body. And the question is not, is this the body or is this not the body? But rather, where am I placing the locus of my identification? What aspect of the body, of my own body, in all of its many layers, as we'll see, and also in relation to the cosmic body or the planetary body or the governmental body, the national body, all of these bodies that we in various ways identify ourselves with, when we over-identify, or when we identify with one part instead of another, or when we identify with one part at the exclusion of the whole, or the interconnectedness, however you want to think about it, the totality, then we are contracted, right? As I was saying on Tuesday, this notion of contraction and expansion, contraction, sankocha, is a really key concept in the non-dual Shakta-Shaiva Tantric tradition. So what body are we identified with? And that is sort of the underlying question that we'll keep in kind of our back pocket as we move through the presentation. Okay. Okay. Well, I guess I can just mention Floss did a wonderful job just revisiting sadhana school is coming up. This is all kind of in some ways a reflection of the kind of work we do in sadhana school, all of what we're doing in the next few weeks. And then we don't have living room lectures next week because we're doing the Navaratri celebration where we're going to be exploring the Ashtamatrikas. So if you're interested in that, there's information. Okay, let's skip that. So as I was mentioning, we've been working through, or rather what was mentioned on the landing page, these 4 methods, these upayas. And I had mentioned how these upayas or these methods are one way that we can think about them is that they reflect degrees or relative degrees of proximity with a kind of immediacy of understanding of reality itself, right? So those who are most intimate, most proximate to that knowledge, that identification, require no method. So actually, the question, I could put a caveat or an asterisk next to the question from Tuesday about, well, do we really need all these things? Actually, the tradition does speak about there being particular individuals who don't need these paths, who don't actually need methods, but not because methods aren't important or they're a distraction, but because certain constitutions of individuals, perhaps because they grew up in a particular cultural circumstance where that kind of esoteric wisdom was already available, right? If we're in another culture where esoteric wisdom is not the emphasis, let's say, for example, capitalism has become the religion, or hardened notions of rigidified religion and various kinds of absolutist fundamentalist doctrine have become sort of the predominant notions of what counts as quote unquote religion or spirituality or whatever you want to call it, philosophy. We require a little more because those systems become embodied, right? And those systems become embodied, and we recognize through our own personal psychology, through our history, through our experience, what those knowledge systems have done to us. They've limited us in some way. So we recognize we have a vision or a sense, a kind of impulse toward a recognition that there's something more. And this initial impulse we talked about on Tuesday as being Śāktopāya, the descent of the Shakti. And then that kind of inkling of there being something else. There's something more to this life. There's something more that I am meant to understand in the grand scheme of my many lifetimes, or just this one. There is this turning toward. But then just because we've turned toward it doesn't necessarily mean we can just be like, my teacher calls this the talking school. It's like non-duality. Yes, I understand intellectually and therefore I am non-dual. No, right? We are, non-duality is a psychophysical kind of embodiment. It is a disposition of our perception and our attention. And depending on what the conditioned circumstances are of our physical, psychological, mental, emotional lives, then we need different tactics. We need different techniques. So in that sense, I find this kind of system of the 4 upayas very pragmatic. It's really saying that, what is necessary is what works for you, and the tantric system has just all these different methods and all these different means, all these different practices in order to ameliorate the contractions of our individuated body mind, to dissolve the forms of ignorance that are kind of dominating our attention and limiting our perception. And so today we are technically in kind of the wheelhouse of the jñāna-śakti, which is the Shakti of knowledge, or what is associated with the Śāktopāya, the method of the Shakti, or Shakta. We'll skip that. So what is the subtle body? So there's a bit of a confusion, perhaps less people, so many people know about the subtle body, right? It's such a common topic that I imagine there's a lot of people who feel like, well, I already know what that is. And maybe you do, maybe you've kind of thought about this distinction. But there is a kind of confusion, I think, just from what happens with, terms. We have terms and they become very loaded. They carry a lot of different meanings. we kind of project upon them a whole bunch of other, various maps and systems. And subtle body is really a great example of this. So the term subtle body is often used as this kind of umbrella term for your generalized non-physical body, your energetic body, your emotional body, right? And it is often used to refer to in what we see in the tradition, and we'll look more closely at this, but just to kind of give a opening template. It's often used to refer to this kind of amalgamation of karmas and samskaras. So your subtle body is sort of, your little hodgepodge of samskaras, and that's what's transmigrating from lifetime to lifetime. And we'll see where we find this in the tradition. It's something we find in the Vedanta. We also find it in Sankhya, classical yoga. And then what many of you may be familiar with as the subtle body is actually what I would refer to as the tantric body. And it's the psychophysical map or the cosmic map that we use in the context of tantric yoga, which many of you will be familiar with as the 6 or the 7 chakras, the 6 or the 7 chakras, the nadis, the granthis, and so on. So the tantric body, or what is often called the subtle body, which is chakras, granthis, mandalas, mantras, yantras, are actually a set of visualization techniques, whereas the subtle body is the condition, we could say, of our nervous system, of our energetic tapestry that is already here, right? It's what we're working with. So if we make a distinction for our purposes today, and again, I'm not trying to say this absolutely has to be the definition of subtle body versus tantric body, and everybody who says chakras are a part of the subtle body are wrong. That's not what I'm saying. I'm doing a very, doing a very kind of academic type of thing where for our purposes, I'm making this distinction for the sake of clarity. But if you like using the term subtle body for chakras and nadis, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm just making this distinction so we can understand what we're talking about. So yes, for the tantric tradition, we can distinguish then between the subtle body as one's existing position of energetic contraction, and the tantric or yogic body, which is the visualization body that we use as a tool to dissolve this contraction, right? Or these contractions, right? Because we probably have a few of them, if you're like me. So let's kind of rewind a little bit and look at where we see what some of you will be perhaps very familiar with if you're, somewhat familiar with the Indian tradition. We're actually going to go a little further back even when we talk about the 5 koshas, but we'll talk about what emerged in the kind of Vedanta commentaries here for a moment, which is, and sorry, just to give you a little context if you're not familiar. So the Vedas, which are the ancient manuscripts of Hinduism, they are considered the most ancient scriptures. We really don't know how old they are. There was an oral tradition that preceded the physical, writing of these texts. And at the end of the text, so the most of the Vedas are concerned with ritual, and then at the end of the Vedas, or the final books that are added to the Vedas, are the Upanishads, which are basically philosophical, and they shift from external rituals, being interested in external rituals, to being interested in internal rituals, i.e. meditation. So we could say that the tantric tradition is very much, well, they do a lot of rituals. That's another question, another subject for another day. But we are very much kind of, and so is classical yoga, in the lineage of sort of the end of the Vedas, right? The Upanishadic type of meditative tradition. And then the tradition known as Vedanta, the end of the Vedas, is actually a commentarial tradition that's very diverse that comments on the Upanishads. So it tries to interpret the Upanishads. The Vedanta is a hermeneutics of the Upanishads. Oh, okay. So the 3-body doctrine is then essentially from this commentarial tradition, to give you just a bit of the history and where it comes from. So we have 3 different bodies. We have the gross body, the subtle body, and the causal body. The gross body, or the stula sharira, is the physical material body that's composed of the 5 gross elements, the mahabhutas. It's the vehicle through which one experiences the waking state, right? So you've heard of Jagrat, Swapna, Sushupti, and so on, and then the fourth state of consciousness. So there's waking, dreaming, deep sleep, and then the fourth state, and the fourth state is associated with samadhi. But anyway, if you haven't heard of that, no worries, it's not really our topic for today. So the gross body is what's subject to birth, growth, decay, and death. So when you transmigrate, according to this tradition, you don't bring your physical body with you, which is obviously evident from the fact that we see the physical body left behind when individuals leave this planet or this plane. So then we have the subtle body, which I suppose in Western or rather Abrahamic traditions would be referred to as the soul. I don't really like this translation because it's a bit misleading, because actually, in this tradition, if we said it was the soul, you're actually, if the subtle body is the soul, then it's a soul that you're looking to get rid of, actually. So it's a bit of a misleading kind of translation, because the subtle body is not what you want to bring with you. You actually are looking to dissolve it eventually, so that you can, whether you're looking to leave the cycles of suffering behind, or whether you're looking to achieve liberation in this or that yogic way, you want to essentially eradicate the samskaras that are embedded in your subtle body. So it's made up of what are called the inner instruments, the antakarana, buddhi, ahankara, and manas. And then also, we'll look at this in a second. It's called the eightfold instrument, or the city of eight, the puriyashtaka. The buddhi is your pre-egoic awareness space. So it's essentially your unconscious. It's the storehouse of latent impressions. It's where all your samskaras live. So all your positive and negative samskaras are in this kind of pre-egoic, in other words, below the threshold of your conscious mind type of space. And it is constantly acting upon you, right? It's constantly rising into your awareness field, shaping your perception such that you're seeing reality or relating to reality in a particular way. That's the buddhi. It's often translated as intellect, but this is sort of misleading translation as well. And then the ahankara is the I maker. It's the function of your psychology that says this is me or mine. It is the function of the I, right? And so, and it's sometimes translated as ego, but this is a bit misleading as well, because you've heard of traditions say, get rid of your ego, kill your ego. This is absolutely not the tradition or the position of the Tantric tradition. The ego is not a problem. The problem is our over-identification with the I, or our idea that the I is exclusively representative of our body, to go back to the question of where do I place the identification of my body. And so we are most commonly, right, rooting our identification of our body in our ahankara. We could say that. We are very ego-centered, not because the ego is a problem again, but because we have not been cultivating the knowledge such that we can begin to see, perceive, and perhaps even experience this subtler locus of our own identity that is below the threshold of the conscious mind, or is more expansive than our individual limited body mind. Which doesn't mean we leave that body mind behind. It means we situate the body mind within a broader, kind of more expansive identity. So anyway, so subtle body is made up of all of this. Then we have the causal body, which is where these seeds or latent states of the subtle body, composed of ignorance and the undifferentiated causal impressions. This is what causes the karma in the next lifetime. So it's what we bring with us, such that our subtle body shows up in a particular way in the next lifetime. And this is just a position of the tradition. If you don't believe in reincarnation, you can just figure out your own interpretation of it. But that's essentially what it means, or what it's pointing to. Okay, so the philosophical purpose of the three-body doctrine is really to just explain how the self appears as the individual experiencer under its various forms of limitation. And so liberation from this perspective is realizing that the true self is distinct from all these three bodies, which are superimposed coverings, right, that are kind of obscuring access to the Atman. And by the way, the Atman is a better translation of soul. However, it's not individual. in the sense that when you become Brahman, or when Atman becomes identified with Brahman, you become one with kind of the ocean of consciousness. So again, it's a very, if we want to translate it as soul, we have to kind of put a little disclaimer on that, because it's very different from the kind of Christian idea or the Abrahamic idea. And then the framework is central in Advaita Vedanta for analyzing, again, bondage and freedom. So very similar to what we're going to see in a moment when we get to the koshas. Not, well, actually, there's some important differences, but we'll see. So just to give you a sense of where we find this, you can see this in Shankara's a commentary, Viveka Chidamani. And the gross body is composed of the 5 gross elements. It is subject to birth, growth, decay, and death. The subtle body is constituted of the mind, intellect, ego, and the vital forces along with the organs. It is the instrument of experience. The causal body is beginningless ignorance, the seed of the other 2 bodies, right? So in other words, and this is true in the Tantric tradition as well, the root problem is ignorance, right? The root problem is ignorance. And so if you can quiet, or rather dissolve, that root ignorance, then from the Vedantic perspective, you actually extinguish all causality, and therefore you no longer transmigrate from lifetime to lifetime, which is, for some of us, kind of a sad view, because we think, well, I actually don't want to leave this world behind. It's like the idea of, completely, leaving the cycle of samskara doesn't sound as nice as going to perfection, in some sort of other plane of existence. So sometimes there's some bristly responses to this view. Okay, so the 5 koshas. This is not a wonderful image, but it does the job. We have actually a few of these here that I'll show you. So the 5 koshas is very popular. We find it in the Taittiriya Upanishad, so it's an early reference. And there are essentially 5 koshas. 5 koshas. The Annamaya kosha, which is literally Anna means food. Annam, Maya kosha. So the sheath of the food body. So the physical body essentially. Then the Pranamaya kosha, the sheath of energy or the life force. Then the Manomaya kosha, the sheath of the mind. But here there's no distinction between the mind and emotions. So this is kind of the heart, the mind and emotions are here. It's not just thoughts. Thoughts and emotions are at the level of Manomaya. Then the Vijnana-maya kosha is Vijnana. I mean, there's actually various ways you could interpret this, but often it's translated as wisdom, right? Vijnana. This wisdom, or experiential wisdom, you could also translate it as experiential knowledge. And then the Anandamaya kosha is the bliss. Ananda means bliss. So we have the sheath of bliss. And then in the center, they put soul, but it's the Atman, right? The Atman would be what would be at the center of, what we would find in the Upanishads and in the Vedanta. So what is not apparent in this picture is that all of the outer layers are also pervaded by every layer that comes more central to it, if that makes sense. So in other words, the Annamaya kosha also includes the food kosha. The outer sheath also includes Pranamaya kosha, Manomaya kosha, Vijnanamaya kosha, and Anandamaya kosha, and the Atman. So it pervades all of those layers. And then, but as you get further in towards Atman, each one, you're getting subtler and subtler. But the idea of Vedanta is ultimately your true self is separate from all these sheaths. You are the Atman, and therefore you are looking to actually, at least in the renunciatory view of Advaita Vedanta, you're looking to leave the world behind. You're looking to leave the ephemeral change of your embodiment. Okay, so we'll just go through this kind of briefly because I want to get to the tantric view. But again, gross physical body, pranamaya kosha is the sheath of the life force, which is comprised of the 5 pranavayus. We'll look at that in a moment. Then the third, manomaya kosha, the mental sheath or the mental emotional sheath. It's the sheath of the mind and also the sense organs. And then Vijnanamaya kosha is associated with discernment, intellect, also experience. So, when we talk about discernment here, it's not just sort of like, I discern between this and that idea. It's a deeper discernment. It's a subtle discernment. It's a kind of psychophysical discernment, a deep inner knowing that, transcends and is below the threshold of your conscious mind. So, take that again, intellect and discernment, words that we often in the West associate with the intellectual mind, with a grain of salt. Anandamaya kosha, the bliss sheath, the innermost sheath associated with the causal body. Okay, so, and again, you can look into this if you want a reference. You can read about this in the Taittiriya Upanishad. Yes, so the Pancha Kosha doctrine, that's 5 sheaths, Pancha and Kosha. Pancha means 5, Kosha sheath. Doctrine teaches that the self is mistakenly identified with one or more of these sheaths, and through discernment, discrimination, and realization, one discerns that the self pervades all of these sheaths while being simultaneously beyond all 5 and identical with Brahman. I should just say there's a bit of a equivocation in that slide, because it sort of includes the renunciatory Vedantic view, or what's often associated with Advaita Vedanta, and the Tantric view. And it's important to remember, like, non-dual Tantrikas like to be like, Advaita Vedanta isn't really non-dual because they're saying that Maya is illusion. This is, if you've not heard of this, then apologies, but it's one of these kind of like controversies. And it is an overstatement, because there's actually a lot of schools of Vedanta that respond to this issue, respond to this problem, and actually do so by taking on a much more tantric view, which is that Maya, or illusion on the one hand, and Brahman, absolute consciousness on the other hand, are actually, like, Maya is a part of Brahman. It's the Shakti of Brahman, the power of Brahman, which is Tantric. It's a Tantric view. So when people say, oh, Vedanta isn't real non-duality, they're actually just there are traditions of Vedanta that, view Maya this way, namely Shankara, Adi Shankara. But you're kind of creating a straw man argument when you say that all of Vedanta is making a mistake or doesn't solve this problem around non-duality, because there's extensive philosophical literature in the tradition, and they were not dumb. They were extremely precise in their arguments and very sophisticated in their ways of resolving these kinds of paradoxes. Okay, so in the Tantric tradition, we see a slightly different 5-layered self. Okay, and let's start actually from the bottom in this slide, which is Vastu, which actually is not one of the 5, which you'll see pretty quickly, I think, or easily in a moment. So Vastu is our stuff, the things we have that become an extension of ourselves, our income, our belongings, our material wealth, our social status. I mean, think, like, let's bring it back to the question from that opened us up today. Where do we place the identification of our body? Well, we do this all the time. We identify with our home. We identify, I mean, not to put it crudely, but we also identify with our relationships. They are an extension of our body. Which is not to say that we're, again, looking to leave it behind. We'll get there in terms of how steeping ourselves in a subtler layer actually enriches our relationships rather than takes us away from them, even though it might seem, as I'm describing this, like a kind of cynical anti-relationship view, but it's not that. So there's this layer of our identification that is at the level of our stuff. And that's certainly very familiar to all of us living in capitalist modernity. Then the most gross layer, of course, is deha, or the body, the apparent body, or the physical body. And this is another thing that we place a lot of identification in. How do I look in the mirror today? I'm too fat, I'm too thin, I'm too this, I'm too that, I wish I had more hair. Like all of these ways in which we obsess over our appearance. And we place and we derive our sense of value or authority or validity from how we identify with that physical layer. And then we have the chitta layer, which is our heart mind, which is basically includes both our thoughts and our emotions. So we mentioned this already. There is no, there's no radical distinction between thoughts and emotions. So we have to really let go of our kind of Cartesian attachment, right, to Descartes' famous distinction between the thinking substance, the res cogitans, and the res extensa. Res extensa is our extended body. This is where we get mind-body dualism from. So this distinction between thoughts and feelings is actually a Western idea, right? It doesn't, we find it throughout the Indian tradition, there's no distinction between these things. And the difference is one of degree, right? And we know, we experience this all the time. When we are in a very dark place emotionally and we feel really down, what kind of emotions show up? I'm unworthy. I feel like crap. Like it's a constant mantra of, crap. And then when we are like feeling luminous and vibrant and content, there is a different sort of set of thoughts that are correlating with that. And so we see this also in kind of the theory of the polyvagal theory as well, this kind of logic mapped onto this theory where, we have been very obsessed in the Western tradition with changing the physical qualities of the body through psychological interventions and through talk therapy, super important. But we've forgotten that we also have these various somatic disciplines and contemplative practices that can also change the mental state, but from the bottom up, right? From the bottom up, which is why we do meditation and why we chant and why we do asana. We do asana because we are changing the mind. We're just doing it in this other way. But again, we're not favoring this over this and just flipping the map. We are synergizing them. We are recognizing that we need both, basically. Okay. Then in the prana level, at the prana level, we have the life force energy. Now, this is not, there some of the maps of these things you'll find like, oh, the energy body, the prana body is the energy body, and therefore this is where the chakras live. That's not what it's saying. The prana level, and also in the five sheaths, the pranamaya kosha is referring to the five directions of the breath, right? The five sort of movements of the breath. So we have the pranavayu, which is the outward moving breath or the exhalation. We have the apanavayu, the downward breath or the inhalation. We have the samanavayu, the equalizing breath, or the breath that balances the inhale and the exhale. It's also associated with digestion. Udanavayu, which is the rising breath, speech, vomiting, sneezing, and also the rise of the movement of upward of kundalini. So it's the upward moving breath. And then Vyanavayu, the pervasive breath, the physical movement. So like, throwing our arms around is also this pervasive breath. And, the distribution of elements in the body and just in the way that, we imbibe certain, I don't know, health supplements, and they get distributed to all the various parts of the body that they need to. That energy, that wind, that vayu is this particular vayu, the pervasive breath. And so this is, the way in which energy moves in the body. And the reason why in the five koshas, it's in between the body, the annamaya kosha, the food body or the physical body, and the manomaya kosha, is because it interacts between them and facilitates a transmutation or transformation between them. So you can change your mind and your body via your breath. And it works in both directions, basically. But in the tantric view, the prana doesn't sit between, the mind, the heart mind, and the body, like you saw before, right? You can see it. It's above the heart and the heart, mind, and the body. And that's due to the fact that in the tantric system, with almost without exception, all of the various psychic maps are reflecting this trajectory from gross to subtle and subtle to gross. Because as we discovered on Tuesday, everything is about manifestation on the one hand and reabsorption on the other. This pulsation of spanda, reality manifesting and reabsorbing itself infinitely and at every level of every moment, and at every kind of moment or at every moment of life, this is happening, this kind of spanda or vibration of manifestation and reabsorption. So that is why, that's the logic of why we see prana above heart, mind, and body, because it's considered to be subtler than the mind, which is subtler than the body, which is subtler than the stuff. So we're moving towards the deepest layer of subtlety possible right now. Then we have the shunya, which is the void state or the transcendent state, or what some like to refer to as Shiva without Shakti. So Shiva, in terms of its kind of metaphysical understanding, is the container of, it's the container of consciousness. It's prakasha, the light, the luminosity by which all things appear. But everything that appears is Shakti, right? Everything that appears is Shakti. So to be in this kind of perfectly quiescent, transcendent, oceanic, still state is the shunya state. And in classical yoga, and also in some expressions of Vedanta, this is actually the end. Oh, and also you could say, you can make an argument that this is the end of Buddhism as well. That we are actually, going to this transcendent state behind all change, behind all ephemeral reality, or beyond, all ephemeral reality, and we're going to stay there. And a lot of people will reach this state and stay there because they think it's the end. Because, again, to go back to the importance of knowledge, because that is what so many spiritual traditions say is the end, right? It says this is the end. But the problem with becoming overly attached there is that it becomes very difficult to interact in daily life. This is a place where if you get stuck at that level, as beautiful and peaceful as it is also a place where it's very difficult to also be in relationship with the world, because the world is changing. The world is dynamic. And therefore, if you have reached a state of pure quiescence, and you believe that this is the final state, and there is nothing sort of subtler than that, then you'll resist leaving it behind. So the tantric tradition, the non-dual tantric tradition, says that in the state of chit, in localizing and identifying ourselves at the state of chit, which is or samvit, non-dual consciousness, we are experiencing consciousness as simultaneously immanent in everything and transcendent, right? So what we might say, that void state that we experienced as independent from everything, in the chit state is experienced as equally present in everything. So in other words, at the deepest, subtlest level, according to the tantric tradition, we develop and cultivate a vision of the divine in everything. That is essentially the view. Everything is a manifestation of the Shakti. Everything is an expression of consciousness. And I know that this is it can be a topic that really brings up stuff for people, because it's like, but then where do I establish my agency around morality and ethics, right? If everything is the divine, then how do I take a stand against this clear injustice? This is a very beautiful, rich, and complicated topic, and there is an answer, but it would take me a very long tangent to go into it. But I'll just maybe say very briefly that the short answer is that when we come from that perception, it isn't that because when we say, well, if everything's divine, then what's the point? We are saying that still from the identification somewhere in, up the ladder, right? We're still saying that from an identification with the heart mind. And when we are localized, when our identification is localized in this kind of, divine vision, basically, this divya chakshus, right? This divine eye, we perceive, and it's not like suddenly, everything, looks like heaven. It's a subtle process, right? That gradually kind of evolves and develops over time, and then sometimes it gets contracted and then it expands again, right? Because that's the logic of the way these things move and pulsate. But when we are in a state, like imagine if we are trying to, have some agency over something that's happening either in our personal lives or something that's happening politically, if we are coming from our own contracted beliefs about what's happening or what we can do or what's possible, that will shape the way that we show up. If, however, we are localized in this vision of things that is much more subtle, that at least maybe it's very, very slight, but it subtly understands, it intuitively recognizes that we are all equal representations and expressions of the same dynamic, utterly bliss-saturated, wondrous reality, then the responses, the creative ideas about how to respond, about how to show up, about how to engage, they shift, they change. We suddenly have access to a whole other range of resources that we didn't even know were available. So, so it's not that, this view that when we become more spiritual or when we really take this work seriously, we leave the world behind. It is actually quite the opposite. We develop more capacities, more faculties to make us actually more skillful in life in all sorts of really important and beautiful ways. Okay, so the Puriyashtika. So this is the city of eight, and I wanted to just mention it because it shows up then in the 36 tattvas, which we looked at on Tuesday. So see here what is called the antakadana, or the inner instrument, the buddhi, the hankara, the manas. Manas is the mind, or often there's a little bit of equivocation about the manas, but essentially it's the interface between sense objects and your sense faculties. And then the tanmatras are the subtle elements. So if we look at the 36 tattvas, you can see down at the bottom the tanmatras, and then the mahabhutas to the right. So that in the yogic system, in the tattva system, the physical attributes, or the mahabhutas, actually emerge from the subtle elements, or the gross elements emerge from the subtle elements. And this is just an aside. You don't have to, memorize this. It's not very important. But if you're interested in like the practice of Bhuta Shuddhi that we'll be exploring this year, this becomes kind of an interesting thing to reflect on. So space gets reabsorbed into sound, wind gets reabsorbed into touch, fire gets reabsorbed into form or appearance, water gets reabsorbed into flavor, earth gets reabsorbed into odor. So anyway, when we die, the mahabhutas, dissolve, we leave them behind, and we take the tanmatras, and then the buddhi, ahankara, manas. So we skip the 17 through 26, these faculties, which are contingent to our physical embodiment. So that's probably why we leave them behind. And that's what transmigrates from lifetime to lifetime, and is what carries our karmas and our samskaras. So then remember what we spoke about at the beginning, and here's where we get to the end, and looks like we should have some time for questions, if anybody has any. So when we then look to work on this situation, right? I mean, of course, we want to recognize that everything is already perfect, and it's not about like, oh gosh, I hate what's inside, and therefore I have to change myself and transmute myself. No, it's a recognition that, it's a longing for this experience that, doesn't require you to kind of negate where you're at in any kind of way. So the tantric or yogic body is an imaginal practice, and it's important to distinguish between, I think, imaginal, not imaginary. So it's a use of the imagination for psychophysiological effect, right? The use of the imagination for psychophysiological effect. And I also like to refer to this is my kind of term I'm working with, or working through, I suppose I should say, performative metaphysics, right? So you are looking to actively cultivate a kind of metaphysical worldview, that is, that everything's interconnected, through a development of and a sequence of practice that will gradually develop that vision and that set of views and and perceptions within you, right? It will cultivate that disposition within you. And that's kind of what the repetition of practice is designed to do. So the energy channels or the nadis, the wheels, the chakras, the breath, or the life force energy, prana, the granthis, these are all tools or devices to help you work with the tantric yoga system. So the tantric yoga system is something you implement so as to shift the fabric of your subtle body, or to um, uh, cultivate a different disposition of the nervous system. And that different disposition of the nervous system is what is the condition by means of which you begin to be able to experience these subtler things. So the tantric or yogic body is a kind of inner ecology of perception that reorganizes consciousness. Okay, so here's a couple images. We've got, very busy one on the left. And then we've got the three main nadis, right? Sushumna, Ida nadi, Pingala nadi, and Sushumna nadi. So I won't go too deep into this because we're running out of time for today. But just so maybe for review for some of you, and for those of you who are interested, you can dive a little deeper in this. We also went very deep in this particular exploration during the winter of last year in what was called the Tantric breath. It was our second sadhana in the first year of sadhana school. And it's still available, portions of it are available if you're interested. Okay, so this is an image from a book that'll be familiar to some of you who came to the Kundalini retreat, The Kundalini Energy of the Depths by Lillian Silbern. This is a quite complicated image, but it gives you a sense of kind of the complexity of a lot of this. It gets very complex, actually, and it's diverse. So one thing that is often misunderstood and is a very popular view in kind of the modern spiritual marketplace is this idea of the chakras, right? The chakras versus the chakras. The chakras, I did a whole kind of talk on this, and it's available. And if those of you who are interested, we can make it available in the pre-recorded recordings, or the dashboard for you if you're interested. So I won't rehash it all here. But in the original tantric view, the chakras were visualization devices. They weren't so much thought of as physical areas. Now, obviously, there's energetic felt states when we think about the various areas of what we often consider the main chakra system, the sixth or the seventh chakra system. It's often, it's there's a visceral feeling that when you look inward, you can subtly grasp something there. And however, within the tantric system, the chakras are actually groups of deities, and those deities are associated with numbers of mantras. So in the tantric system, we actually are encoding the body vibrationally through mantras, and each deity is a mantra, right? So it's not like, an anthropomorphic deity is sitting on your heart space. It's not that, it's a vibration. It's a vibratory tool. And it gets very, there's more to say about it, but I won't go down that rabbit hole today. So I just want to kind of point out this distinction. It's not to say that the way you've learned about the chakras is wrong. If it works for you, it works. It's all, as far as I'm concerned, it's all pragmatism. It works for a particular function. However, if you're really looking to align yourself with the kind of tantric soteriology, the tradition of how the tradition sees the experience of liberation and how one accesses that liberative state, the Tantra tradition is saying we are using these visualization devices to imaginally superimpose a particular vibratory field on our existing psychophysical, subtle, nervous architecture. And it was as a result of the repetitive transplantation, in some ways, of this previous imagined body that is created by our own culture and context and history, by repeatedly transplanting aspects of that embodiment with a divine embodiment through mantras, through visualization, through yantras, and through the various movements of prana through the body. And there are various practices that do this. One of them is called uchara, where you trace the vibration up the central channel. As a result of all of this, something begins to happen, right? We become subtler. We begin to see things differently. We begin to have streams of creativity and kind of aha moments that felt altogether impossible before. We suddenly read a spiritual text that previously we thought was BS, and somehow it is scintillating with some kind of truth, right? There is something that shifts in our perception, and it is not necessarily a radical, mystical, enlightened experience that people often, speak about, and by speaking about, I think can make other people in the spiritual community feel deficient, right? Because it's like, I haven't had an experience like that, and therefore I haven't really had a spiritual experience. No, it happens very subtly, right? It's a subtle shift of our thinking, of our patterns of behavior, of our feeling. It's not a radical disjunction necessarily. For some people, it might be quite radical. For others, it need not be. And so even the idea of this violent Kundalini awakening that many people speak about, that's just one way in which Kundalini moves through us. That's just one way. It can move in a way that is much more amenable and integrative to your own personality in a lot of in various ways. Okay, so these are the kind of famous 7 chakras or chakras. But I just wanted to mention that there are many chakra systems. There are many different chakra systems. There are systems with 6, there are systems with 5, there are systems with 20, there are systems with 12. And so we want to, again, make that distinction between the subtle body and the imaginal body or the tantric body that we use. And that can help explain why there are differences of chakra systems. Because if we think the chakras are an absolute physical thing and they exist in there somewhere, then when we see proof of other systems, we're like, wait, so that means this is invalid because it was actually just changing all the time in these different traditions. That's what happens, right, when we kind of misunderstand their original function, or one of the things that can happen. And so understanding that their function had, was to do this kind of work, we can see, okay, well, we can study different traditions in terms of, or understand the variety of different traditions from this perspective of what was this tradition actually trying to do, or what were the unique qualities of this group of practitioners such that they elected to use 12 chakras, right? There may be some interesting sort of psychophysical, cultural, political history there, right? What was the condition of that group of practitioners such that, we needed 12 or we needed 5 or whatever. And one could say that, one could make an argument, I suppose, that the reason 6 or 7 of chakras have become so mainstream is actually due to the fact that this is actually what works for modern people. It's actually working, and that's why it's become so mainstream. Okay, I'm going to skip to this final slide here, and then we'll open up to questions, and maybe Floss can help me facilitate. So how does subtle embodiment change daily life? So as we were mentioning, it cultivates a vision that sees everything as inherently divine and as an expression of the Shakti. It is depth. It offers a depth over a kind of impulse to distraction, or at least we are reminded, right, when we feel agitated and when we feel like we are super overwhelmed and like there's just too much, whether it is in terms of our own tasks and responsibilities or whether it's in terms of the situation in the world, we are reminded when we kind of really steep in the validity of this subtle knowledge, this subtle embodiment, that when we go deep in practice and when we anchor ourselves and root ourselves there for, a period of time, for a sustained period of practice, and we come back into the world, not like we're going away on retreat, but when we do our twice daily practices or even once daily, and when we come out of our shavasana after our meditation and we re-enter our daily pursuits, even just after a few practices, we can notice, wow, I was a bit of a mess before, and now I'm sitting down to do some tasks or to reach out or to respond to an email or to have a conversation with my partner or my friend, and there's just more available. Something subtle, more subtle is available. Some kind of space within which to move that wasn't there before. So that depth offers space. So there's this resilience and flexibility of presence rather than just this kind of knee-jerk indoctrinated performance of this, that, or the other, which is, quite frankly, what many people are operating from in today's world. And so we align or tune ourselves, right, to a kind of cosmic intelligence, right? And that will begin to ameliorate this feeling of alienation, right? This feeling of deep separation, this feeling of what is often referred to in the Tantric tradition as the anavamala. The anavamala is the root limitation of feeling like we are separate individuals, that we are radically distinct from each other, that we are individual, like boundaried beings, separate from everything else. This is the anavamala. And so as we do these practices and as we cultivate subtle embodiment, as we cultivate a relationship with the tantric body and use it to shift the coordinates of our subtle body, when we do this, we dissolve. We begin to break free from this anavamala, this kind of limitation of the anu, the limited being. So living from subtle awareness in a disembodied world is both a personal and a cultural medicine. I put that in air quotes because we're not we're not trying to tell you to not see your doctor. Reimagining devotion, so relating to the subtle as imaginal, right, is a recognition, a recognition, and a rehearsal, right? This is a really important thing, rehearsal of this dedication to the self. So, in some ways, right, the dedication to the self can start as a hypothesis, or the dedication to, you're listening to me, you're like, yeah, I've heard this before, but I don't know if it's true because I haven't I haven't borne out that hypothesis for myself. And in a lot of ways, like any kind of scientific experiment, we want to perform enough, or any scientific hypothesis, we want to perform enough experiments to actually see if the hypothesis is correct, right? So we first have to take on the system, work with it, and then after a sustained period of time, we look back and say, did that work? Was that effective? If it wasn't effective, try something else. But it usually requires, right? I remember when I was initiated in my meditation practice that I do now, my teacher said, do it for 18 months. Do it for 18 months. If it does not work, then try something else. If it's not bearing fruit in any kind of way, right? And what is most often happen is most people reject something purely on the basis of an intellectual rejection of it, right? And just a sort of a prejudice against the very idea that it's possible or that it could actually bear any fruit. So we actually have to have first the dedication to the very idea or the hypothesis, right? We have to be willing to do the experiment. And then we bear out the truth value of those experiments through the daily repetition and rehearsal of these practices. So the last thing, well, let's just open it up to questions actually, and I can wrap it up with that last idea after we speak to each other. Were there any questions that came up, Floss?
Not yet, but do feel free, everyone, to pop some questions in the chat. And thank you, Jacob, for such a great presentation. I'm sure everyone will agree. And if anyone has any comments as well or reflections, they're very welcome.
Yes, I see Victoria's question that then she said, never mind. So it must have been, yeah, responded to with as the, yeah. One thing I should add to that, I'm glad you asked this, Victoria, because there's one other point, is that the sukshma, so the sukshma sharira, as you could see, is in the 25 tattvas. Let's go back to this real quick because it is something that um, we'll talk about more throughout sadhana school if you decide to join us. And it also comes up and, you can explore it on your own as well. But if you look from 12 down to 36, this is the 25 tattvas of the Sankhya. And so this is also the 25 tattvas that are associated with classical yoga. So Tantric yoga is not a rejection of classical yoga. It absorbs classical yoga and the Sankhya tattvas. It just adds to them. And so one could say that the way in which one experiences these higher levels, right? These kind of like, you know, experiencing the 1 through 11 basically beyond the Purusha value, the Purusha, the limited or individual consciousness, right? Is actually through kind of one way is through the tantric technology, right? What we were talking about with the chakras, the visualization, the mantras, and all that. But once again, it's not the only way. It's just one method to do that. So the reason I wanted to say that is because the Puriyashtika is still in here, right? It's still in the tantric system. It's just been, the system of the tattvas that it's included in has been kind of added to additionally by these 11 additional tattvas. And there's actually some systems where there's 39. I think in one book of the Tantra Loka, Abhinavagupta speaks about 39 tattvas. So he gets even more esoteric.
There's a question from Simran Randeep asking, is Tantra dual Shiva and Shakti?
Yeah, so non-dual does not mean anti-dual. Non-dual means more than dual, or it means not two. So Advaita literally means not two-ness, right? So when we say that, when we're saying there's a slight difference between monism and non-dualism. Monism says that everything is one, right? Everything is one. Non-dualism says there are not two things, which means that things appear in our perception to be two, but they are ultimately non-separate from each other, right? They're ultimately non-separate from each other. So this is why, uh, you know, so Shiva is the very capacity to witness anything. It's the light, it's the luminosity of consciousness. We could think if the sun went out right now, well, I mean, maybe electricity would work for a couple minutes, but we would all freeze and, die so we couldn't enjoy it. But, if the sun went out, there was no electricity, it would be pitch black. Well, actually, yes, it would be pitch black. Well, could we see stars? Anyway, you get what I mean. There would be nothing illuminated, right? It would be complete darkness, right? If there was, or let's say we're in a deep cave. I was just in Nepal. I went into one of the biggest, or maybe the biggest cave in Asia, and it was filled with bats, by the way, terrifying. But at one point, he turned the light off, and you could see nothing. I have never been in such darkness before. It was penetrating. It was so dark, it was almost bright, actually. It was just pure blackness. You could not see anything reflected, and you couldn't even know. There was no light, so there was no spatial awareness as well. It was almost like it almost felt claustrophobic in a way, like space had collapsed. And in the same way, the light is what makes anything appear, right? So that is Shiva as Prakasha, or, Prakasha is one way of thinking about Shiva. And then Vimarsha is the reflective capacity, the reflective awareness, which is also the reflective capacity, not only of our thoughts, but also of all physical objects. And so those are non-separate. You can't have one without the other. You cannot have Shiva without Shakti. You can not have consciousness without energy. And so in that sense, it is non-dual. It is non-separate, because you can't exclude anything in a non-dual system. To exclude something, and this is the argument against the Advaita Vedanta, by the way, is, just to go back to that point. If you say, as some Vedantas do, but, again, this is overstated. If you say Brahman is the only real thing, Maya is just illusion. Maya doesn't exist. You're creating a distinction between that which is real and that which is unreal, which is a dualism, or a dualism between the real and the unreal, or the real and the illusory, right? Consciousness and illusion. This is two things. So Shaiva Shakta non-dual Tantra comes along and says nothing can be negated. The problem is not that that there's Maya and there is illusion. It is that we are misperceiving Maya. Maya is actually not illusion. Maya is the power of the goddess of consciousness herself. Maya is the dynamic creativity of consciousness. And so that's why in the final analysis for non-dual Shakti Shaiva Tantra, we are cultivating a different perception that sees everything as non-separate, because nothing can be excluded, right? So that's sort of, I don't know if that answered the question, but tried to capture that. I'm curious about the difference, the tattvas between Sankhya and Shaivism. I've been taught that Tantra is an evolution of the Sankhya tattvas, that the Shiva and Shakti essentially similar to Purusha and Prakriti instead of Sankhya's dualism. Tantra is the same, but sorry, I shouldn't read this so fast for the people who aren't reading this, who are watching it, the recording. Let's see. Similar to Purusha and Prakriti, instead of Sankhya's dualism, Tantra is the same, but merging Purusha and Prakriti as one. They are not separate from each other. Can you please speak to the Shiva Shakti Purusha? So let's go back to this. So in the tattvas, this is a system that is used across Shaivism. So as we can see, Shiva and Shakti and Purusha and Prakriti are at very, very different levels of the map of reality. And as we spoke about on Tuesday, this is a map of grossification or subtilization. So as we move from the 0 to 36, we're getting increasingly gross. And as we move from 36 to 0, we're getting increasingly subtle. And that again is the map that moves from into manifestation from 0 to 36, increasing levels of manifestation, and reabsorption going back to 0. So if Shiva and Shakti are 1 and 2, and Purusha and Prakriti are 12 and 13, then we can't say that they're the same, because, at least according to this view, because this, if we understand what I just said, 12 and 13 are more gross, they're more manifest than Shiva and Shakti. Well, why? At what degree are they more manifest? What is the difference? The difference is quite, actually, I think, it's relatively easy once you kind of grasp it. The Purusha is the expression of consciousness in its individuated form. So this is even true in the classical Sankhya, right? The Purusha, there are many Purushas. They're not just one Purusha, right? There's not one Purusha that is in everything. There's one Prakriti, actually. There's one Prakriti, and there's many, many Purushas. As many Purushas as there are, individuals transmigrating from lifetime to lifetime. Shiva and Shakti is the consciousness that pervades everything. So and so we can think about it that this is in some ways kind of the distinction that Vedanta makes between Atman and Brahman. right? Atman is the individuated consciousness. Brahman is the absolute oceanic consciousness. Similar idea. But Purusha is, but we can also think about it in terms of the contemplative experience. Purusha is an experience that you can have in meditation. And in the Tantric tradition, it's an experience of consciousness, your individuated consciousness being conscious of itself alone. So you become completely absorbed into, for example, the Turiya state. So the Turiya state is the state where there is no activity of thought, right? You are in a state of samadhi. There are many stages of samadhi. Not all of them are completely devoid of objects of awareness, but one of the highest state is objectless samadhi, seedless samadhi. And so in that state of samadhi, you can only infer that you were there. So you were in meditation, you turn on your, clock or whatever, timer for 20 minutes, and then you close your eyes, you're settling in, and then suddenly the alarm goes off and you're like, oh my gosh, like, where did I go? And you can infer that you were in this very deep state of samadhi, but you cannot, you do not have an awareness of samadhi, because awareness requires an object to be aware of in order for you to be conscious of it. As soon as you have the cognitive idea, I am in samadhi, you're out of samadhi, right? At least that level of samadhi. So that independence of Purusha as a pure witness that's conscious, it's witnessing its own witnessing, right? Which is a little bit reflective of the relishing of relishing we talked about on Tuesday. A little bit, it mirrors that somewhat. There's actually a whole, anyway, I won't get into that. It's a digression. So that is an experience, but that's not the ultimate goal, according to the Tantric tradition, is not to go there and stay there, right? That's a renunciatory view. But it's a necessary experience because something happens somatically, psychically for you when you are in this kind of like still state, right? It's a healthy place to be sometimes because, when you are not agitated, when the fluctuations of the mind aren't going, the body can rest, the body can heal, right? And so can the mind. And you get glimpses of this in sleeping. I mean, when you are in a deep sleep, you don't know that anything's happening. You don't have a memory of it. You don't have awareness. It's complete the lack. It's a lack of awareness, of any objects of awareness, right? And yet, when you're in samadhi, there's a lack of awareness, but you are conscious. So we make a distinction between consciousness and awareness. So ultimately in the state of like Shiva Shakti, that experience that you had in Purusha when you were at number 12 here progressively gives way to even subtler, what are called stages or advans, and we're not getting into that today, but it is in various parts of the text or various texts. These various stages, these various kind of planes, but ultimately you are experiencing consciousness in everything, which is different from just experiencing the independence of your own consciousness, if that makes sense. So that's probably the simplest way I can put it. So maybe I'll just leave it there.
There's one question from Diana. How does this
Mm-hmm.
tradition address demonic or oppositional forces meant to help the soul evolve? Is this also a divine force?
Oh, that's a good question. So did you say demonic forces meant to help? Was that what you said?
How does this tradition address demonic or oppositional forces meant to help the soul evolve? Question mark. So I think, are
Yes.
they meant to help the soul evolve? Is this also divine?
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of a complicated question, and I don't know that I can do justice to it today. There is certainly, you know, literature on this. There's references to it even in the Tantra Loka. Abhinavagupta kind of speaks about this, particularly with regards to like ignorant people. Like it's a whole thing he goes in to about like the type of company you keep, right? And how one should be on guard against sort of these various qualities because obviously, when you are you are what you spend time with. So if you have company that is contracting you, you will become more contracted. So it's sort of like this kind of mindfulness of how our communal context sort of shapes our sense of self, I guess. I know that's not exactly what you're asking, but it's sort of pointing to this broader theme of, I mean, there is no good and evil, as it were, in this system, right? Because there is only consciousness. And so insofar as there is evil, there are different kinds of beings in various modes of contraction. Now, are there beings in modes of contraction that are in dimensions of awareness or dimensions of existence that we don't have, we don't have sensory access to? I mean, I don't see why not. I haven't, seen them myself, but I feel like, it's silly to imagine that we know, what kinds of entities are existing at different planes. Sure, there's all sorts of ways to think about this. There's also the tradition in the Indian tradition of this idea of asuras, right? The asuras are these forces of ignorance that the gods and goddesses throughout the mythology are fighting with, but oftentimes, again, or not again, but maybe for the first time, remember that the ultimate point is that everything is your very own self, right? And so insofar as you are in a kind of dynamic relationship with some sort of demonic force, you are in relationship with an expression of reality itself, which is ultimately you, right? So it isn't this kind of like good and evil. There's demonic, there's like light and dark and this kind of thing. That's just not. I don't think that that's compatible with the Nando-Shakti tradition, because nothing, again, can be negated. So even the demonic forces, or negative forces, let's just say, have to be understood within this kind of context of understanding the various contractions and how the contractions actually, what's symptomatic of those contractions is these distorted intentional structures that want to harm, or they want to dominate, or they want to control, right? And so, but the tradition says that even that deep contracted force, first of all, it's a reflection of us. And so in some sense, we're responsible for it in some kind of way. And in some sense, our own work that we're doing at the level of this limited body mind has a reverberating impact on that, right? In ways that perhaps we can't even begin to perceive or even understand. And so feeling powerless over that. I mean, I'm making a lot of assumptions about what you're kind of imagining into this, and so apologies if it's not resonating with you. But this tradition is all about power, right? It's all about empowerment through these practices. By subtilizing yourself, you don't just become, oh, I'm so minimal now. I'm such a small little, tiny little dot now. I've become so subtle. No, you become more potent, more alive, more creative, more dynamic, more imbued with the vitality of consciousness. And so, as a result of that, like vitalization process, you become stronger, right? Like you become not stronger, like hard stronger as like porous, expansive, and influential at the level of kind of your own energetic environment. And so insofar as there are forces outside of you that are malevolent toward you, like, in some sense, it's irrelevant to the process of you cultivating that empowerment, so that essentially, such that those potencies or whatever are there, those forces are there, they can't touch you, basically, or they become absorbed into your spaciousness, and you transmute them or transform them in the same way that, like, showing up in a state of just spacious love and understanding with a person who perhaps came in with guns blazing. Like, I'm sure many of you have had experiences like this. When we can come from a place of softness, gentleness, sweetness even. I mean, unless we're being annoying, like, oh, well, there's obviously really annoying and sort of self-righteous ways of doing that. But when it's authentic and it's born of our own deep sadhana, it will disarm people when they come at you with guns blazing. It's like they become softened in the face and the luminosity of the love that you showed up with in that moment. It's a powerful thing to transform your energy body at this level. So, yeah, I think that's probably enough of that. Thank you, Nuria. That's very sweet. Or when you, I think demonic, I'll read this because this is interesting. I think demonic forces are when you dissociate, like in PTSD. In truth, the innocence of consciousness is still there and nothing happens out of consciousness, but there it looks like you are dissociated from everything, which in turn shows how the devil is illusory through, though experienced. Yeah, that's a really beautiful way of putting it. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't really like the terminology of demons. I think it just makes me think of like it makes me think of a kind of good and evil world where there are demons and like there are these demonic forces we have to like it's a war mentality, right? Because we have to fight the demons. And it's not to say that I mean, we're literally going to be exploring next week the Devi Mahatmya and like the eight matrikas, and they come in guns blazing. So here I am talking about, and they're guns blazing against these demonic forces. But the theme throughout is, again and again, the kind of underlying esoteric meaning of all of this is that actually these forces are within you, right? That these are forces that are within you that you are battling. And the externalization of them is actually the problem, right? If we harden them into like, if we allow them to congeal and map onto this, that, or the other person, and we then vilify that person, then that becomes, a real problem because that causes us to contract in the face of them. Okay. I think we've gone quite enough for today. Does anybody else have a final question? I feel like we've gone for 90 minutes, so we should probably call it a day. Uh, wow, there was a lot there. I probably should have prepared a little less, so apologies if that was a bit, maybe a lot of information to absorb. If you have questions, if you have follow-up questions, please send me an email, sadhana@embodiedphilosophy.com. I will drop it in. And maybe, Floss, if you wouldn't mind dropping the discovery call link in there again, maybe also the link to the sadhana school page. And then I just wanted to mention one last time, well, our next living room lectures. So our next one is going to be a week. So it's in 2 weeks. So we'll meet on Thursday in 2 weeks. And the reason we're meeting on Thursday in 2 weeks and not next week is because starting on Monday, we're doing this depth cycle. And a depth cycle, people keep asking me, and I realize I haven't defined my terms. The depth cycle is kind of a new aspect of sadhana school, although people can do the depth cycles and not join sadhana school, just like you can join one sadhana and not do all the sadhanas. But we are implementing this new retreat, right? We're going to go to in-person, we'll have an in-person retreat next year in July, and it'll also be hybrid so people can join online. But I also wanted to kind of thread these retreat light experiences kind of periodically, quarterly throughout the year. So the depth cycle kind of model will happen. We'll have this one for Navaratri. We'll have one around the new year, in the past we called meditation resolution. So that'll be a depth cycle. And then we'll have another one sometime in the spring. And the idea of these is to do a period of consecutive days and to do the same practice essentially every day. And so it's a little bit like a retreat in that way. And it starts on Monday, Navaratri. Navaratri is the festival of the 9 nights of the Divine Mother. It celebrates Durga, particularly the goddess Durga, who is the warrior goddess. And there's all sorts of mythology and stories that I'll share in the opening talk about Durga and about, then how the 8 matrikas come into being. They emerge as protectors and as as part of Durga's essentially entourage who are fighting these sort of ignorant forces or demonic forces, these asuric forces. And so the whole festival is a kind of celebration of this story and essentially of Durga's success, because she, of course, the goddess of consciousness can't lose. So eventually she defeats these forces. So we'll look a little at the mythology, we'll meditate, and then we'll also explore this hymn called the Ashtamatrika Stotram, which is it's an eight, it's a hymn basically that introduces and celebrates each one of the 8 matrikas. So we'll explore that starting on Monday. So thank you all so much for coming. In living from the subtle body, I was going to kind of share this, so maybe we'll end on it. It is an analogy of the orange that I actually took somebody else, some other teacher used this once, and I thought it was nice. Is right. We know the orange has this outer rind that is quite bitter, right? It's dense, it's bitter, it doesn't taste good. It's like, ugh. And then inside there is the sweetness, right? And the sweetness is the essence of the orange, right? That outer protection is necessary to protect the integrity of that inner essence, but ultimately the sweetness is the essence. And before we begin practice, if we, have gotten to this place of a lot of contraction, reactivity, feeling like very tense in the face of all of the various challenges and frustrations and agitations of life, then we come from that rind, right? We interact with the world from this kind of bitterness. And the contemplative practices, whether it is this tantric tradition or whether it's something else, it's not sectarian here. You could do it with Christian mysticism, you could do it with Buddhism, you could do it with Vaishnavism, you can do it with all of any tradition that has a sustained technology of contemplative practices. And some of them have lost their technology, sadly, but you can still find them if you search for them. So it's any contemplative technology does this work of subtilizing and drawing the locus of our identity ever more deeply toward that sweetness. So that, and again, it's not a putting on of airs. It's not like, now I'm going to be the nice, sweet yogi. No, it comes naturally and spontaneously as you steep deeply within yourself through the daily repetition of your own sadhana. It comes to life, this kind of sweetness. And initially, you kind of don't have, it's like you can't speak from there, right? And in another talk, when we come together in a couple of weeks, I'll talk about this concept of bhavana. Bhavana is the manifestation for realists. It's where we actually develop the capacity to come from this space with our words, with our actions, because initially, as we get in touch with it and we deepen into it and we cultivate a relationship with it, our personality still sort of has ownership of the surface of life. And so slowly we start to build these connections or create these connections between this inner sweetness that we're discovering and the languages that we participate in, the actions that we perform, the way we show up in our lives, what we bring to the world creatively, and all the rest of it. So it's all part of the same picture. So until we meet in a couple of weeks, please feel free to send me any messages you like. You can also reach out and ask questions. If you do sign up for a discovery call, just know Floss and I will both be there, so you can ask us both about your questions if you have any. And again, if you're just here for these 4 sessions with us, that is totally okay. We are very happy to have you, and it's really lovely to have so many of you with us in these sessions. So until we meet in a couple of weeks, have a wonderful weekend. Stay safe, and let me know how it goes living from the subtle body in a disembodied world. See you next time.